The moment where everything changes is not a duel or a battlefield revelation, but a decision made in silence. Anakin Skywalker does not reject fear by overpowering it, but by refusing to let it define his next step. He listens to the warnings he has spent years suppressing and finally recognizes manipulation not as destiny, but as strategy. This single act of clarity fractures the Sith plan because it removes secrecy, which was always its greatest weapon. By choosing transparency, Anakin dismantles the illusion of inevitability that has been tightening around the galaxy for years. Instead of confronting darkness alone, Anakin brings what he knows to the Jedi Council and forces a reckoning that cannot be postponed or dismissed. The Council is no longer reacting to fragments and intuition, but to testimony from the individual Palpatine invested everything in corrupting. This exposure does not immediately unify the Jedi, but it does something far more dangerous to the Sith. It collapses the narrative control that allowed manipulation to thrive in ambiguity. Once the truth enters the open, it can no longer be shaped quietly behind closed doors. Palpatine is revealed too early and without the leverage he spent decades constructing. His power was never solely rooted in the dark side, but in patience, timing, and isolation. Without Anakin as both apprentice and symbol, the carefully layered threat collapses into something visible and therefore contestable. The Sith plan relied on appearing unstoppable only after it was already complete. Exposure mid-construction turns omnipotence into suspicion, and suspicion into resistance. The Clone Wars do not end with a decisive victory, but with systemic failure. Once Palpatine's dual control over both the Republic and the Separatists begins to unravel, coordination collapses across the conflict. Orders contradict one another, supply lines destabilize, and loyalty fractures among leadership. What was once a manufactured forever war loses coherence because it no longer has a single, invisible hand steering both sides. The war ends not with domination but with exhaustion and revelation. This conclusion reshapes how the galaxy understands conflict itself. The war is no longer remembered as a necessary tragedy, but as a constructed crisis prolonged for power. That realization alters public trust permanently and weakens any attempt to revive similar tactics. Systems built on deception cannot survive once their mechanics are exposed. In this timeline, the war becomes a warning rather than a precedent. The Jedi Order survives, but it does not emerge unchanged or unchallenged. The near collapse forces introspection that centuries of tradition had avoided. Their detachment, their political proximity, and their fear of emotional complexity are no longer abstract criticisms but proven vulnerabilities. Survival demands reform, not denial. The Order is shaken into evolution rather than annihilated into legend. Anakin becomes central to this transformation, not as a flawless figure, but as a living contradiction to old dogma. He embodies attachment, responsibility, and compassion without surrendering discipline or purpose. His existence challenges the binary thinking that equated emotion with weakness. The Force is no longer framed as something to suppress, but something to understand honestly. This shift does not weaken the Jedi, but grounds them. The presence of Padme Amidala fundamentally alters the post-war Republic. She survives not as a symbol of lost idealism, but as an active political force, shaped by proximity to catastrophe. Padme does not retreat into mourning or abstraction, but channels urgency into reform. Her voice carries weight because she stood at the centre of the storm and lived. This grants her moral authority that legislation alone could never provide. Within the Galactic Republic, Padme becomes a rallying point for resistance against authoritarian drift. Emergency powers are scrutinized rather than normalized. Militarization is questioned rather than expanded. Transparency becomes a political demand rather than a rhetorical flourish. Reform is not framed as idealism but as survival. Anakin and Padme together represent a convergence the Sith never accounted for. Emotional honesty paired with institutional accountability dismantles the false choice between security and freedom. Their partnership reframes strength as cooperation rather than domination. Power becomes something shared and examined rather than hoarded. This redefinition undercuts the philosophical foundation the Sith depended on. The Jedi's renewed relationship with the Republic becomes cautious and deliberate. They step back from unquestioned generalship and reclaim their role as guardians rather than instruments. This distance does not weaken their influence, but restores trust. By refusing to be enforcers, they regain moral clarity. The galaxy no longer views them as extensions of the state, but as a stabilizing conscience. Anakin's role evolves from Chosen One mythology into something quieter and more sustainable. He becomes a bridge between generations, between philosophy and lived experience. Younger Jedi learn that balance is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. The Force becomes a dialogue rather than a doctrine. This cultural shift reshapes training, mentorship, and identity across the Order. Most importantly, the future is no longer shaped by trauma avoidance. Decisions are made proactively rather than reactively. Fear loses its predictive power because catastrophe has been interrupted rather than endured. This alters how institutions plan, how individuals trust, and how the galaxy imagines tomorrow. Prevention replaces redemption as the highest ideal. The absence of a fallen Anakin removes the emotional cornerstone upon which galactic terror would have been built. Without that symbol, fear lacks a face, and authority lacks mythic reinforcement. Power remains, contested, visible, and accountable. The galaxy moves forward not unscarred but unbroken. That difference changes everything. From this foundation, a very different future begins to take shape, one where rebellion is unnecessary because collapse never occurs. If you want me to continue forward into how this reshaped galaxy unfolds and why resistance never becomes the defining story, just say the word, and we will carry it forward. With the Sith exposed before their final consolidation, the galaxy never experiences the psychic shock that would have defined an age. Fear never crystallizes into doctrine, and obedience never hardens into reflex. Power remains contested, visible and fragile, which prevents it from becoming absolute. This instability is not chaos, but accountability, because no single authority is allowed to masquerade as destiny. History continues forward without the weight of inevitability pressing down on every decision. The failure of Palpatine's endgame removes the symbolic center required to sustain an empire of terror. The Galactic Empire either never fully forms or exists briefly as a contested experiment rather than an unquestioned reality. Without a singular enforcer to embody consequence, fear lacks cohesion. Systems of control rely on myth as much as force, and here the myth never solidifies. Authority fractures before it can entrench itself. Order 66 becomes an idea rather than an execution. Fragmented commands, conflicting loyalties, and exposed contingency plans render it ineffective. Thousands of Jedi survive not through luck, but because the system meant to erase them cannot synchronize. Survival on this scale fundamentally alters galactic memory. The Jedi are not reduced to whispers and ruins, but remain a living institution, capable of learning in public. This survival changes how power interacts with the Force itself. The Jedi are no longer mythologized through absence or trauma. They remain visible, flawed, and evolving, which prevents idealization from calcifying into dogma. The Force stays integrated into society rather than isolated into legend. Its practitioners are accountable because they are present. In this future, the children who would have inherited secrecy instead inherit openness. Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa grow up without the burden of hidden lineage or deferred truth. Their connection to the Force is introduced as education rather than revelation. Training is communal, transparent and grounded rather than reactive and desperate. This alone reshapes who they become. Without trauma shaping their earliest lessons, Luke does not chase heroism as escape. He learns patience, context, and responsibility alongside power. The Force is framed not as destiny calling him forward, but as a discipline inviting understanding. Growth becomes steady, rather than explosive. Balance is learned gradually instead of seized in crisis. Leia's relationship with leadership unfolds without the shadow of tyranny defining her purpose. Politics is not a battlefield she's forced into, but a system she helps refine. Her sensitivity to the Force deepens her empathy rather than isolating her. Authority becomes something she questions instinctively because she was raised watching it remain accountable. Her strength is expressed through clarity rather than defiance. The absence of an all-consuming rebellion changes galactic culture at every level. Resistance. Movements still exist, but they are localized, specific, and political rather than existential. Conflict is addressed through reform exposure and coalition instead of insurgency. Violence is not romanticized because survival never required it. The galaxy does not learn to equate hope with destruction. This alters how heroism itself is defined. There are no legendary sacrifices required to restore balance, because balance was never lost. Courage is measured in restraint, transparency and patience. Progress is incremental, visible, and imperfect but real. The story shifts from redemption arcs to preservation ethics and from survival to stewardship. Perhaps the most profound change is philosophical. Balance is achieved not through annihilation of extremes but through prevention of collapse. Light and dark are understood as tendencies to be managed rather than forces to be eradicated. The Force becomes a relationship instead of a battleground. This reframing dissolves the binary thinking the Sith depended on. In this timeline, the galaxy never needs to mythologize its suffering to make sense of it. Memory is not dominated by loss, but by lessons learned early enough to matter. Institutions remain fragile but flexible. Authority remains powerful but watched. The future is shaped by interruption rather than recovery. That difference defines everything that follows. This is a Star Wars story where the greatest victory is subtlety, where catastrophe is avoided instead of survived, where balance is not restored after devastation, but maintained through awareness. It is quieter, less operatic and far more radical, and in that quiet continuity, the galaxy finally earns peace rather than purchasing it with ruin.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.